Hello, this is Darrell Castle with today's Castle Report. This is Friday, the second day of May in the year of our Lord 2025. I pause today to remember some anniversaries that are very significant in the history of the United States and the entire world for that matter. In addition, I will endeavor to talk about the world as it appears to me today, many years past those anniversaries, some of which I have personally experienced. Next week, the 8th of May, is the 80th anniversary of the German surrender in World War II. I talk of that surrender today because it will happen before my next Castle report in Russia. They remember what is called Victory in Europe Day on May 9th instead of May 8th. Usually, Russia has a military parade before the Kremlin in Moscow to memorialize the Great Patriotic War, as they call it. However, they don't memorialize what happened for 40 years after the war. The Stalinist show trials, millions of dead are nothing to celebrate, I guess. From my American viewpoint, though, I talk about the anniversary to honor those who served and those who died. This year, 11 world leaders have announced they will attend the celebrations in Moscow, including Chinese Premier Xi, but I haven't heard of any Americans in attendance. If I were president, I would be there, or at least send a high-ranking representative. When General Eisenhower visited the airborne divisions on the night they were to jump into occupied France for the D-Day invasion, he said, "We may never see their like again." And at this point, I will say he was right. At least I don't see them right now. Long before D-Day, the Americans had some catching up to do because Germany had been fighting in Europe for 2 years, and only Britain held them at bay across the Channel for 2 years alone. I risk being overly dramatic, I know, about the war against Germany, but on the other hand, that would be very difficult to do since the courage and sacrifice of the men who fought the war is hard to exaggerate. For example, right after Pearl Harbor, the 8th Air Force was formed and assigned to defeat the Luftwaffe, which at that time was the best air force in the world, appeared to be unstoppable. The 8th had 8 pilots and no airplanes at the time. 3 years later, by D-Day, the Luftwaffe had been driven from the sky. Their experienced pilots were dead. Their country's infrastructure was a pile of rubble. That happened because 55,000 young men gave their lives in the skies over Germany and France. A B-17 crew of 10 men had to complete 25 missions to get a break at home for a while. The average life expectancy of those men was 15 missions. The chances of surviving all 25 missions, 1 in 4. That improved a little bit when the P-51 Mustang fighter was available later in the war because it had the range to escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Germans were fine warriors, dedicated men who fought hard for their country, but on May 8th, 1945, they reached a state of unconditional surrender. Hitler was dead, apparently. Apparently he was dead. Perhaps he lived out the rest of his life in luxury down in Argentina, who knows, but apparently he was dead. And the head of state was Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had commanded the U-boat campaign and later the German Navy. Dönitz sent General Alfred Jodl to sign the German surrender, and Jodl tried to time it so as many German soldiers as possible could make their way west and surrender to the Americans. Eisenhower told him that if he did not surrender immediately, he would close the West to Germans and they would be left to the tender mercies of General Zhukov and the Red Army. No German wanted to be at the mercy of the Russians because of the merciless way they had conducted warfare inside Russia. Germans who were taken prisoner by the Russians, hundreds of thousands of them, had a way of never returning to Germany alive. Well, Jodl signed the Articles of Surrender on German home ground and with Russian officers in attendance. Eisenhower was a national hero, of course, the most popular man in the free world. He was destined to become president. Just a few years later, the free world did not include the Far East at that time because the war against Japan continued until August, but that's another anniversary for another day. And looking at the German surrender, thinking of the men who fought their way across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, finally Germany itself. My conclusion is that as Americans, we have lost the honor of calling ourselves worthy of them. You would have thought that World War II, with its millions of deaths, would have taught the world a lesson, and it did teach ordinary people the horrors of war, but for the ruling elite, well, they never seemed to get enough of it. For example, the Soviet Union, which probably would have been defeated by Germany without the resupply convoys of American and British ships, started to believe it should be at the head of the post-war world order. To that end, it set about spreading its idiotic ideology of communism around the world. In totalitarian countries like North Korea and China, it found fertile ground. Thus, just 6 years later, 6 years after World War II, the world was at war again. In Korea, that invasion of North Korea, invading the South in an attempt to unite Korea under communism, cost about 35,000 American lives. Just to get back to pre-war neutrality, however, Korea is not the anniversary that I remember today, because from all this carnage emerged even more carnage in the form of Mao and his Cultural Revolution with its 50 million dead. This week, we remember the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War 50 years ago. After a couple of years of negotiations about prisoners, the shape and position of the conference table, the final papers were signed. Most prisoners were released. For some of those men, they had been tortured, starved, imprisoned for 6 years. The war in Vietnam, formerly Indochina, or more accurately, French Indochina. In reality, it lasted 30 years, because in 1945, after the Japanese had been defeated, General Eisenhower and President Truman agreed that the Asian colonies which existed before the war should be returned to their European owners. Ho Chi Minh up in North Vietnam didn't appreciate that, and he began a war of independence against France, or perhaps he just continued the same war he had been fighting against the Japanese. When he finally defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the French agreed to leave Vietnam. General Eisenhower still would not agree to free elections. In about 1960, the U.S. saw that the Communist North was winning the war, and they decided to take the place of the French. The rest is history, folks, but there are lessons. In the 15 years the U.S. spent in that hellhole of a country, I knew many of the men who fought there, from those of general officer rank all the way to private. They were taken from the farms, factories, gas stations, high schools, homes of America, and sent into the meat grinder, which they knew nothing about, should never have known anything about, should never have been forced to care about. The lesson, in my opinion, as I look back at the 50th anniversary, is that the lives of those who serve are precious and should not be sacrificed so carelessly. People fight hard when someone invades their country, and determined guerrillas with a willingness to accept any casualties are pretty hard to defeat, especially when they have the help of local countries who know that you will not risk total war with them to prevail. It was thought better by U.S. leadership to sacrifice all those men, take all those casualties, rather than risk war with China or Russia in order to prevail. This is indeed a valuable lesson, but did we actually learn anything? Obviously not. The lesson is valuable, but it's not the real lesson. The real lesson is to let people run their own countries in the way they see fit. How much sacrifice are you willing to bear in order to set the world in the order that pleases you? Looking back after 50 years, this whole thing stinks to high heaven. The decision to fight in the first place, the decision to not seek victory, smells of the military-industrial complex and the new globalist world order. One is reminded a little of the disease of cancer when thinking about it. The money is not in curing cancer, it's in treating cancer. Keeping the patient alive with very expensive lifetime treatment is a lot more lucrative than curing the disease. It pleases those who profit in money and power to keep eternal war going. That, at least in part, explains some of the hatred against Donald Trump. He appears to be at least trying to find peace in the currently ongoing war. Speaking of which, speaking of the current wars, the India-Pakistan war in Kashmir seems to be on again, rapidly escalating toward full-scale war. The Chinese, right on the border, seem to favor Pakistan in this struggle. I suspect they have an easier time controlling Pakistanis than Indians, but that's just a guess. The Pakistani defense minister the other day said this week that considering the Pakistani incursion that killed 27 Indians, he expects an Indian reprisal, and he announced that war is therefore imminent. Both countries are nuclear armed. The defense minister said that Pakistani nuclear forces were placed on high alert. What does any of this have to do with the United States? Absolutely nothing. For that reason, I'm hopeful the U.S., as much as it appears to love war, will let these people fight among themselves without our help. I'm certain many contractors are licking their chops at the prospects of how possible this war could be, but I pray that Donald Trump is able and willing to resist them. The struggle over in the Middle East between Israel and Iran takes a new twist almost every day. Recently, Netanyahu said that he expects to be finished in Gaza by September or perhaps a little sooner. That sounds encouraging, folks, until you think that it means several more months of pounding the rubble that is now Gaza. It also means that Israel will, at some point in the near future, be able to turn its attention fully upon Iran and Ukraine. The war rages on. Putin said he would hold a ceasefire for 3 days around the celebrations in Russia of their victory in the Great Patriotic War. Ironically, the area of fighting right now is where the greatest armored battle in history took place between the great German Heinz Guderian and the Russian commanding General Marshal Zhukov. So it seems that not much changes in this world, certainly not human nature. Finally, folks, what is the correct American foreign policy to remember these anniversaries? Come home, mind your own business. Not isolation, but Fortress America. The correct way for me to remember them is to raise a glass and remember. So I think I'll do that tonight. At least that's the way I see it, folks. Until next time, this is Darrell Castle.